She can't fly anymore.
The voice crackled through static, followed by 4 distinct laughs echoing from the black box recorder. Captain Donovan Stone's finger hovered over the pause button as the timestamp burned across the screen. 14:27:33. 3 lenses. 1 lie. 0 way out. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Hayes stared at the audio waveform on her laptop, the small spikes and valleys representing the last words Jessica Williams would ever hear. The 29-year-old Criminal Investigation Command Specialist had seen plenty of military accidents in her 8 years, but nothing like this. Nothing that made her stomach clench with the certainty that she was staring at evidence of murder. The emergency call had come at 6:15 that morning. "Training accident at LZ Delta," the dispatcher had said, voice clipped and professional. 1 KIA, Private Williams, helicopter maintenance specialist, fell during routine training flight. Routine. The word tasted bitter as Hayes reviewed the preliminary report outside the Fort Carson aviation hangar. 23-year-old Jessica Williams from Billings, Montana. Honor student. Perfect safety record. Fell 500 feet during what should have been a standard maintenance inspection flight. "Orders don't cover murder," Hayes muttered, closing the folder. The Colorado morning air bit at her cheeks as she walked toward the command building, where Captain Stone waited in Conference Room B, his uniform pressed to military perfection, but sweat beading along his hairline despite the crisp October temperature. The T-72-hour countdown had already begun. Congressional hearing on military aviation safety scheduled for Monday morning. $2.3 billion in budget approvals hung in the balance. Fort Carson's 25,000 personnel needed this story clean, contained, and explained away as equipment failure or human error. But that audio clip wouldn't cooperate. Hayes slipped her earbuds back in, rewinding to the crucial 3.7 seconds. Male voice, confident. "She can't fly anymore." Pause. Then laughter. 4 distinct voices, crude and satisfied. Then nothing but wind and the mechanical whir of helicopter rotors. Her phone buzzed. Text from Colonel Patricia Ward. "Complete access granted. Whatever you need for thorough investigation. We want truth." Colonel Ward. 20 years of exemplary service, nationally recognized advocate for women in the military. If anyone understood the stakes of this case, it would be her. Hayes had read Ward's speeches about breaking barriers and protecting female soldiers. The kind of commander who actually gave a damn. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and nervous sweat. Captain Stone sat ramrod straight, his pilot's wings catching the fluorescent light. 34 years old, 15 years in the Army. Clean record except for some gambling debts that had been flagged but not pursued. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "Walk me through the flight," Hayes said, settling into the chair across from him. She pulled up the official incident report on her tablet. Departed at 1400 hours. 4 crew members aboard for maintenance inspection training. Stone's jaw tightened. 3 crew members. Me, Thompson, the crew chief, and Specialist Rodriguez. Williams was... He paused, swallowing hard. Williams was having issues with heights. Panic attacks? She froze up during the exercise and lost her footing. Hayes tapped her stylus against the screen. The GPS telemetry data painted a different picture. 4 distinct tracking signals throughout the flight, not 3. But she kept that detail to herself for now. "Tell me about Williams's performance issues." "Attitude problems," Stone said quickly. "Resistance to authority. Always questioning orders, filing complaints about the work environment. Thompson and I tried to help her adjust, but..." He spread his hands. Some people aren't cut out for military aviation. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Hayes studied Stone's face, noting the way his left eye twitched when he mentioned complaints. 3 formal harassment complaints in 6 months. She'd seen the files, all mysteriously resolved internally without disciplinary action. Did you know Williams had requested a transfer off the aviation team 3 days ago? Stone's face went pale. No, I wasn't aware of any transfer request. Hayes pulled up the document on her tablet, turning it so he could see. Colonel Ward's signature at the bottom, approving the transfer effective the following Monday. The signature was dated 3 days before Williams's death, the same day someone had used colonel-level authorization codes during radio communications. This is the first you're seeing this? Stone studied the signature, his breathing shallow. Colonel Ward handles all personnel transfers. She mentioned Williams was having adjustment issues, said she was working on a solution. Hayes made a note. Ward again. The colonel seemed to be involved in every aspect of Williams's case, from the initial complaints to the final transfer approval. Professional involvement or something deeper? Her phone buzzed with another text from Ward. Captain Stone, briefing complete. I'm available to discuss next steps whenever you're ready. Helpful. Almost too helpful. Hayes leaned back in her chair, watching Stone's Adam's apple bob as he struggled to maintain composure. Captain, I need you to understand something. This investigation is going to be thorough. Congressional hearing Monday morning means national attention. If there's anything you haven't told me, now would be the time. I've told you everything, Stone whispered. It was an accident, equipment failure, panic attack, whatever you want to call it, but I didn't push her. None of us did. The denial came too fast, too specific. Hayes hadn't accused anyone of pushing Williams, but Stone's mind had gone straight to physical violence, which meant he knew more than he was admitting. She closed her tablet and stood. I'll need to interview the other crew members, and I want a complete mechanical analysis of that helicopter. Stone nodded, relief washing over his features. Of course, whatever helps clear this up. As Hayes left the conference room, she caught a glimpse of Thompson at the end of the hallway, a thick-set man in his late 30s with calloused hands and suspicious eyes. He'd been watching the interview through the window, she realized, keeping tabs. Her phone rang as she stepped outside. Colonel Ward. Staff Sergeant Hayes, Patricia Ward, I wanted to personally thank you for handling this investigation. I know it's not easy, dealing with tragedy and political pressure simultaneously. Ward's voice carried the kind of authority that came from 2 decades of command experience. Measured, confident, concerned in all the right places. Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate the complete access you've granted. Williams deserved better than what happened to her. Ward continued. As women in this military, we have to look out for each other. I want you to know I'm here to support your investigation in any way possible. Hayes felt a flutter of gratitude. In a male-dominated institution, having a senior female officer's backing meant everything. I may need to review some personnel files, command decisions from the past few months. Whatever you need, my aide will coordinate access. And Hayes, don't let anyone pressure you to rush this. Truth matters more than convenience. The call ended, leaving Hayes standing in the parking lot with a growing sense that Colonel Ward might be the one ally she could trust in this investigation. Someone who understood both the personal stakes and the institutional pressures. Before we continue with Hayes's investigation, I want to thank those of you who've shared your own military experiences in previous videos. Your insights help us understand these complex situations. If you're following Hayes's pursuit of justice, hit that like button. And if you appreciate this deep dive into military accountability, The thanks button really helps us continue investigating these stories. Tell me in the comments, what's your take on Colonel Ward's supportive approach so far? Hayes drove across the base to the evidence storage facility, a concrete building that smelled like metal and disinfectant. Her security clearance granted access to everything related to the Williams case, including the helicopter's black box and maintenance records. The mechanical analysis painted a troubling picture. All flight controls had functioned normally. No system failures, no equipment malfunctions, no environmental factors that could explain Williams's fall. The UH-60 Blackhawk had performed exactly as designed throughout the flight. But the GPS telemetry told a different story. Hayes pulled up the flight path data on her laptop, watching the 4 distinct tracking signals move across the digital map of Colorado airspace. Stone, Thompson, Rodriguez, and Williams, all clearly identifiable by their individual GPS units throughout the 90-minute flight. No panic attack, no freezing up. Williams had been moving normally right up until 1427. Then, one signal disappeared. The timestamp burned in Hayes's memory, 1427:33, the exact moment of the audio recording. She can't fly anymore. 4 laughs, then silence. She rewound the GPS data, studying the moments before Williams's signal vanished. The helicopter had been in stable hover at 500 feet, conducting what should have been routine maintenance inspection procedures. Williams's signal showed normal movement patterns, consistent with someone performing assigned tasks, until it stopped. Hayes printed out the GPS analysis and cross-referenced it with the official flight manifest. 3 crew members listed: Stone, Thompson, Rodriguez. But the telemetry clearly showed 4 people aboard throughout the flight. Someone had altered the manifest after the fact. Her phone rang. Thompson. Staff Sergeant? Chief Thompson here. Wonder if we could talk about the Williams situation. Got some information might be helpful. His voice carried the gravelly tone of a 20-year veteran, but underneath lurked something that sounded like fear. I'm available now, Chief. Meet me in Conference Room B in 10 minutes. Thompson arrived early, pacing the small room like a caged animal. His personnel file showed 2 previous harassment complaints that had been resolved internally, both involving female personnel, both resulting in no disciplinary action. But his military record was otherwise solid. Commendations for technical expertise, leadership awards, respect from his peers. About Williams, he said without preamble, settling his bulk into the chair Stone had occupied earlier. Captain Stone's not telling you everything. Hayes activated her digital recorder. Go on. She was scared. Last few weeks, she'd come to me asking about transfer procedures, saying the work environment had gotten hostile. Said some of the guys were making her life hell, but she wouldn't name names. Did you report this up the chain of command? Thompson's laugh held no humor. To who? Stone? He was part of the problem. Or at least that's what Williams thought. She said he'd been making comments about women not belonging in aviation maintenance, questioning her technical competence in front of the other crews. Hayes made notes, but something felt off about Thompson's testimony. Too convenient, too willing to throw Stone under the bus without implicating himself. Where were you positioned during the inspection flight? Portside crew chief position. Williams was starboard, conducting routine checks on the sensor array. Rodriguez was forward, with Captain Stone in the cockpit. And you saw Williams fall? Thompson's hands clenched into fists. Happened fast. 1 minute she was working, next minute she was gone. I heard her scream, but by the time I got to the door, she was already... He shook his head. Couldn't do anything. Hayes pulled up the GPS toolbar on her tablet, showing Thompson the tracking information. This telemetry suggests Williams was moving normally right up until 1427. No indication of panic or distress. Thompson studied the screen, his face growing pale. GPS can malfunction. Environmental interference, equipment failure. Wouldn't rely too heavily on electronic data. But Hayes had noticed something in Thompson's eyes when she mentioned the timestamp. Recognition. Fear. He knew exactly what had happened at 1427:33. Chief, did anyone use radio authorization codes during the flight? Colonel-level access codes? Thompson's jaw tightened. Wouldn't know about that. Radio communications were handled by the cockpit crew. Another non-answer. Hayes sensed Thompson knew more than he was admitting, but pushing too hard might shut him down completely. Better to let him think he was controlling the narrative while she gathered evidence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Ward. How's the investigation progressing? Available for consultation if needed. Hayes showed Thompson the message. Colonel Ward has been very supportive of this investigation, granted complete access, offered any assistance we need. Ward's a good officer, Thompson said carefully. Looks out for her people, especially the women on base. She's been working hard to improve conditions, implement new harassment prevention programs. Were you aware that Williams had filed 3 formal complaints in the past 6 months? Thompson nodded. Word gets around. But all those complaints were handled properly. Internal review process, mediation, resolution. Nobody wanted Williams to feel unwelcome, but sometimes personality conflicts happen in high-stress environments. Hayes felt a chill run down her spine. Thompson's words echoed the exact language from the official complaint resolution documents, the ones bearing Colonel Ward's signature. Either he'd memorized the paperwork, or someone had coached him on proper responses. Who handled those complaint resolutions? Command level. Colonel Ward's office coordinates all harassment investigations, ensures proper procedure is followed. Ward again. Hayes was beginning to see a pattern. Every thread of this investigation led back to the base commander. Either Ward was the most competent officer Hayes had ever encountered, or she was orchestrating something far more complex. Thompson stood abruptly. Look, Staff Sergeant, I want Williams's family to have closure, but I also want my crew protected from false accusations. We're good soldiers who made mistakes, not monsters. Sometimes accidents happen, even when everyone follows procedure. After Thompson left, Hayes sat alone in the conference room studying her notes. 2 interviews, 2 different versions of events, but both men seemed terrified of something beyond the normal consequences of a training accident. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted email from the base medical examiner's office. The subject line read, Williams autopsy, classification pending. Hayes opened the message and felt her blood freeze. Dr. Sarah Chen had completed the preliminary autopsy on Williams, but the results were being held pending national security review, an almost unheard-of classification for the death of a maintenance specialist. The email included a brief note. Cause of death consistent with fall trauma, but several anomalies require additional investigation. Full report delayed per Base Command directive. Base Command, Colonel Ward's office. Hayes picked up her phone and dialed the medical examiner's office directly. Dr. Chen, Staff Sergeant Hayes, CID. I need to discuss the Williams autopsy results. I can't discuss details over the phone, Chen replied, her voice tense. But I can tell you this. Williams didn't die the way you think she did. Meet me at the base medical facility tonight at 9 p.m. Come alone. The line went dead. Hayes stared at her phone, adrenaline surging through her system. Williams's medical records sealed under national security classification. Autopsy results being withheld by Base Command. GPS data showing 4 people on a flight manifest that listed only 3. Someone was orchestrating a cover-up, and that someone had enough authority to manipulate evidence at the highest levels. Her phone rang again. Colonel Ward. Hayes, I wanted to check in on your progress. I know this investigation is weighing heavily on you. Colonel, I'm encountering some obstacles. The medical examiner's report has been classified, and I'm having difficulty getting complete information. That's concerning, Ward said smoothly. Let me make some calls. National security classifications can sometimes be applied too broadly, especially when lower-level personnel are trying to avoid scrutiny. I'll see what I can do to expedite access. I appreciate that, Colonel. Hayes, I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your abilities. This investigation matters, not just for Williams's family, but for the integrity of our entire command structure. Don't let bureaucratic obstacles discourage you from pursuing the truth. Ward's words should have been reassuring, but something nagged at Hayes. The colonel seemed to have solutions for every problem, access to every restricted file, influence over every roadblock, almost as if she'd anticipated each obstacle before it arose. The base cafeteria buzzed with nervous energy as Hayes grabbed dinner, catching fragments of conversation from nearby tables. Word of the investigation was spreading despite official attempts at containment. Soldiers whispered about harassment complaints, about command failures, about the need for justice. Did you hear about Williams? A female sergeant at the next table said quietly. 3 complaints in 6 months, all swept under the rug. Makes you wonder how many others are keeping quiet. Her companion nodded grimly. Ward's been pushing for harassment prevention training, but talk is cheap. When push comes to shove, it's still the good old boys protecting each other. Hayes felt a stab of doubt. Was Colonel Ward really the ally she appeared to be, or was she simply playing a longer game? The evidence suggested institutional failure, but every piece of that evidence had been filtered through Ward's office at some point. At 8:45 p.m., Hayes drove across the base to the medical facility. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars belonging to night shift personnel. She found Dr. Chen waiting in the pathology lab, a slight woman with tired eyes and nervous hands. "Thank you for coming," Chen said, locking the door behind them. "What I'm about to show you could cost both of us our careers, but Williams deserves justice." Chen pulled up Williams's autopsy files on her computer, displaying high-resolution photographs of the body. Hayes had seen death before, but Williams looked so young, so small on the examination table. Official cause of death is blunt force trauma consistent with a 500-foot fall, Chen began. But look at these injury patterns. She pointed to several areas on the photographs. Williams sustained significant trauma to her back and shoulders, injuries consistent with being pushed or thrown, not with an accidental fall. The distribution of impact points suggests she was conscious and struggling during the fall. Hayes leaned closer, studying the evidence. "Are you saying someone physically threw her from the helicopter?" "I'm saying the trauma patterns are inconsistent with panic-induced loss of footing. Williams was fighting back when she fell." Chen switched to another screen showing tissue analysis results. "And there's something else. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms. Fresh bruising around her wrists, consistent with being grabbed and restrained." Hayes felt sick. Williams hadn't panicked and fallen. She'd been murdered. Why was this report classified? "Base Command Directive came down this morning. Colonel Ward's office called directly, said national security protocols required additional review before release." Chen's voice dropped to a whisper. "But here's the thing. I completed this autopsy yesterday afternoon. Someone waited until after I'd documented everything to invoke the classification." Hayes stared at the evidence displayed on Chen's computer screen. Williams had fought for her life aboard that helicopter. Someone had grabbed her, restrained her, and thrown her to her death, while 3 other people watched, and Colonel Ward had moved to suppress the evidence. What would you do if you were in Hayes's position right now, confronting evidence that your trusted superior might be involved in covering up a murder? Let me know in the comments while we see how Hayes handles this shocking discovery. The drive back to her quarters felt like a funeral procession. Hayes parked outside the single-story building that housed junior officer housing, but couldn't bring herself to go inside. Instead, she sat in her car, staring at the stars over Colorado and trying to process what she'd learned. Williams had been murdered. The autopsy proved it beyond doubt. But the murder weapon wasn't a gun or knife. It was institutional power, used to silence a young woman who'd dared to speak out against harassment and abuse. Her phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Ward. "Hope your evening research was productive. Let's connect first thing tomorrow to discuss next steps." Hayes stared at the message, ice forming in her stomach. How did Ward know she'd been conducting evening research? Unless Ward had been monitoring her movements all along. Hayes deleted the message without responding and drove to the base library, one of the few buildings with 24-hour access for personnel. She needed a secure internet connection and a quiet place to think through the evidence. The library's computer lab was deserted, except for one airman working on correspondence courses. Hayes logged into her secure CID account and began cross-referencing all the documents related to Williams's case. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Williams's first harassment complaint, filed 4 months ago, investigated by Colonel Ward's office, resolved through mediation and counseling. Williams's second complaint, filed 2 months ago, again handled by Ward's office, resolved through additional sensitivity training for all personnel. Williams's third complaint, filed 6 weeks ago. Ward's office again, resolved through voluntary transfer request to more suitable assignment. Every complaint, every resolution, every piece of paperwork bearing Colonel Ward's signature. But here was the crucial detail Hayes had missed before. The transfer request that Ward had approved was dated 3 days before Williams's death, but Williams had filed it 6 weeks earlier. Someone had backdated the approval to make it look like Williams was actively seeking escape from her situation, rather than being eliminated because of her complaints. Hayes printed out all the relevant documents and spread them across the library table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The picture they formed made her physically sick. Ward wasn't protecting female soldiers from harassment. She was protecting the institution from the consequences of harassment complaints. Williams hadn't died because Stone or Thompson were evil men acting on their own. She'd died because someone with command authority had decided that eliminating her was preferable to addressing her legitimate grievances. At 2:30 a.m., Hayes's phone rang. Unknown number. "Staff Sergeant Hayes, this is General Morrison, Pentagon Oversight. I understand you're conducting an investigation into the Williams incident." Hayes's blood went cold. Pentagon involvement meant this case had escalated far beyond Fort Carson's chain of command. "Yes, sir. CID investigation into training accident involving Private Williams. Staff Sergeant, I want you to understand the broader context of your investigation. Congressional hearing Monday morning will determine budget allocations for military aviation programs. $2.3 billion in funding that supports jobs for thousands of military families." Morrison's voice carried the weight of 4-star authority, but underneath was something that sounded like desperation. A drawn-out investigation that raises questions about command competence or institutional failures could jeopardize that funding. I'm not asking you to compromise your integrity, but I am asking you to consider the bigger picture. "Sir, I believe Private Williams was murdered. Silence stretched across the phone connection for nearly 30 seconds. That's a serious allegation, Staff Sergeant. Do you have conclusive proof that would stand up in a court-martial proceeding? Hayes thought about the autopsy results, the GPS data, the doctored manifests. Compelling evidence, but nothing that couldn't be explained away by a skilled defense attorney with institutional backing. I'm still gathering evidence, sir. Then I suggest you gather it quickly. Congressional hearing is Monday morning. If you can't present a complete case with ironclad proof by then, the investigation will be transferred to Pentagon jurisdiction for broader review. The line went dead, leaving Hayes alone in the library with the certainty that powerful people wanted this case buried. The question was whether she had enough courage and enough evidence to stop them. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted email. The sender was listed as a friend, but the content made Hayes' hands shake as she read. Staff Sergeant Hayes, Williams wasn't the first. Check personnel file XK7749, archived records from 18 months ago. Specialist Linda Morrison, helicopter maintenance, similar circumstances. Ruled suicide after harassment complaints. Also handled by base command. Pattern established, pattern protected. Meeting location, Hangar 7, Maintenance Bay, tomorrow 0600 hours. Come alone. Trust no one in command structure. Hayes stared at the screen until the words blurred together. Another death. Another young woman silenced by the same system that was supposed to protect her. She ran a search for personnel file XK7749 and found the archived record. Specialist Linda Morrison, age 22, died 18 months ago from what was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But the circumstances surrounding her death were strikingly similar to Williams's case. Multiple harassment complaints, all resolved internally, growing pressure from command to adjust her attitude or seek transfer. Morrison's suicide note included in the file read like a template for institutional cover-up. Cannot handle military environment, feel like failure. Don't blame anyone for my weakness. But buried in the medical examiner's report was a detail that jumped out at Hayes. Morrison's gunshot wound was inflicted at an awkward angle that would have been difficult to achieve if self-inflicted. The examining physician had noted the discrepancy, but accepted the suicide ruling based on the note and testimony from her commanding officers. The same commanding officers whose signatures appeared on Williams' complaint resolutions. Hayes printed Morrison's file and added it to the growing stack of evidence on the library table. 2 young women, 2 harassment complaint patterns, 2 deaths ruled as accident and suicide respectively. Both cases handled by the same command structure. As dawn broke over Fort Carson, Hayes realized she wasn't investigating a single murder. She was uncovering a systematic pattern of elimination that had been operating under the cover of institutional protection for years. At 5:45 a.m., she drove to Hangar 7, her service weapon secured in its holster, and her digital recorder running. The maintenance bay was deserted, except for a single figure standing beside a UH-60 helicopter, the same model that Williams had fallen from. The figure stepped into the light as Hayes approached. It was Rodriguez, the specialist who'd been listed on the flight manifest, but hadn't been interviewed yet. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, his young face etched with fear and determination. "Thank you for coming." Rodriguez was 24, born in San Antonio, 3 years in the Army with a spotless record. But his eyes carried the haunted look of someone who'd witnessed something terrible. "I was there when Williams died," he said without preamble. "In the cockpit with Stone. I heard everything over the intercom system." Hayes activated her recorder. "Tell me what you heard." Thompson and Stone were pressuring Williams about her complaints, said she needed to withdraw them or face consequences. Williams refused, said she had rights, said she wasn't going to be intimidated anymore. Rodriguez's voice shook as he continued. That's when Thompson said it. She can't fly anymore, and Williams started screaming, fighting back. I could hear the struggle over the intercom, but Stone ordered me to stay at my station, said everything was under control. Hayes felt her heart racing. Did you see what happened? Stone turned off my intercom feed right after Thompson spoke, but I could see Williams's GPS signal on the navigation screen. She was moving around the cargo bay like she was trying to get away from someone. Then her signal just disappeared. Why didn't you report this immediately? Rodriguez laughed bitterly. To who? Stone was the flight commander. Thompson outranked me, and when we landed, Colonel Ward personally debriefed me, said national security required discretion, that false accusations could destroy innocent careers. Hayes showed Rodriguez the Morrison file. Did you know Specialist Morrison? Rodriguez's face went white. She was my girlfriend. 18 months ago, she started having problems with the same crew. Stone, Thompson, same harassment pattern, filed complaints, got pressure to withdraw them. And you believe she was murdered too? I know she was. Linda would never commit suicide. She was planning to transfer to a different base, start fresh. But 3 days before her transfer was approved, she was found dead in her quarters. Gunshot wound, suicide note that didn't sound like her voice at all. Rodriguez handed Hayes a small digital device. This is Linda's phone. I kept it after the investigation closed. She recorded some of her conversations with command personnel, documenting the harassment and the pressure to stay quiet. Hayes connected the phone to her laptop and began reviewing the audio files. Morrison's voice, young and frightened, but determined. They told me that complaining about harassment makes me look weak, that real soldiers adapt to challenging environments instead of running to authority figures. Another file, timestamp 2 weeks before Morrison's death. Colonel Ward called me to her office today, said my complaints were causing morale problems for the entire unit, asked if I really wanted to be responsible for destroying good soldiers' careers over personality conflicts. Hayes felt physically sick as she listened to Morrison's final recording, made the night before her death. I think they're going to transfer me somewhere even worse. Ward mentioned disciplinary action if I don't withdraw my complaints. I'm scared, but I can't keep letting them treat women like this. Someone has to stand up. The audio files painted a clear picture. Morrison had been pressured, threatened, and ultimately silenced when she refused to back down. And the same pattern was being repeated with Williams. Rodriguez, I need you to testify about what you witnessed on that flight. I will, he said firmly, but you need to understand, this goes deeper than Stone and Thompson. They're just enforcers. Someone higher up is calling the shots. Someone who can manipulate evidence and control investigations. Hayes thought about Colonel Ward's helpful guidance, her offer of complete access, her ability to expedite classified materials. Either Ward was an exceptionally competent commander, or she was the architect of a systematic cover-up operation. I have reason to believe Colonel Ward may be involved in the cover-up. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Ward's been at Fort Carson for 3 years. Morrison died 18 months into Ward's command. Williams died 6 months later. How many others are there that we don't know about? Hayes drove back to her quarters as the base came alive with morning activities. Soldiers heading to PT formation, maintenance crews preparing for the day's operations, the normal rhythm of military life continuing while she sat on evidence of systematic murder. Her phone buzzed with multiple messages. Colonel Ward, ready to discuss investigation progress. My office, 0900 hours. General Morrison, Pentagon. Expecting preliminary report by end of business today. Congressional hearing Monday requires clear resolution. Unknown number. Drop the investigation or face consequences. Final warning. Hayes stared at the threat message, wondering who had sent it and how they'd gotten her personal number. The investigation had exposed something far larger than a single training accident, and powerful people were moving to contain the damage. At 8:45 a.m., she walked into Colonel Ward's office for what she suspected might be the most dangerous conversation of her military career. Ward sat behind her desk, surrounded by commendations, photographs with senators and military leaders, and awards recognizing her advocacy for women in the military. Staff Sergeant Hayes, thank you for your dedication to this investigation. I know it hasn't been easy. Ward's voice carried its usual measured authority, but Hayes detected something different, a slight tension around her eyes, a careful control of her body language that suggested stress. Colonel, I've uncovered some troubling evidence that I need to discuss with you. Of course. That's why we're here. Hayes pulled out her files and placed them on Ward's desk. The autopsy results show Williams died from homicide, not accident. GPS telemetry proves 4 people were on that flight, despite a manifest listing only 3. And I've discovered a pattern involving the death of Specialist Morrison 18 months ago. Ward picked up the Morrison file, scanning it with professional detachment. Morrison's death was thoroughly investigated. Tragic suicide, but not related to the current case. Colonel, I have audio recordings of Morrison describing pressure from command to withdraw harassment complaints, the same pressure that Williams was facing before her death. Ward's expression didn't change, but Hayes noticed her hands had gone completely still. No fidgeting, no unconscious movements, the kind of control that suggested intense focus. Staff Sergeant, investigation can sometimes create patterns where none exist. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Both Morrison and Williams were troubled soldiers struggling with adaptation to military culture. Hayes felt a chill run down her spine. Ward's response was too smooth, too prepared, as if she'd rehearsed these exact words. Colonel, with respect, the evidence suggests systematic elimination of soldiers who file harassment complaints. Someone with command authority has been orchestrating these deaths. Ward stood and walked to her window, looking out over the base she commanded. When she turned back, her expression had shifted subtly, still professional, but with an edge that Hayes had never seen before. Staff Sergeant, I'm going to share something with you in confidence. This investigation is being closely monitored at the highest levels of government. Congressional budget approvals, international military relationships, the stability of our entire aviation program, all of these hang in the balance. Ward sat back down, leaning forward with the intensity of someone sharing classified information. Sometimes individual tragedies must be viewed in the context of broader strategic necessities. Williams and Morrison were troubled soldiers whose continued complaints threatened unit cohesion and military readiness. Their deaths, while regrettable, removed sources of instability that could have damaged far more people. Hayes felt the world tilt around her. Ward wasn't denying involvement in the deaths. She was justifying them. Colonel, are you saying that Williams and Morrison were murdered to protect institutional interests? I'm saying that effective command sometimes requires difficult decisions, decisions that prioritize the greater good over individual concerns. The mask had finally slipped. Colonel Patricia Ward, advocate for women in the military, protector of harassment victims, was revealing herself as the architect of their elimination. Hayes's hand moved instinctively toward her service weapon, but Ward noticed the movement and smiled coldly. Staff Sergeant, I wouldn't recommend any precipitous actions. This office is monitored by security cameras, and any footage of you threatening a superior officer would end your career and your investigation permanently." Ward returned to her desk and picked up her phone. "Captain Stone, please report to my office immediately, and bring Sergeant Thompson with you." Hayes realized with growing horror that she was about to be silenced the same way Williams and Morrison had been. Ward had orchestrated the entire investigation, using Hayes' own thoroughness to identify loose ends and potential witnesses that needed to be eliminated. As footsteps approached in the hallway outside, Hayes made a desperate decision. She activated the emergency function on her phone, sending her location and a distress signal to every contact in her directory. The door opened to reveal Stone and Thompson, both men looking grim but determined. "Gentlemen," Ward said calmly, "Staff Sergeant Hayes has uncovered information that threatens operational security. She'll need to be transferred to a more appropriate assignment where her talents can be better utilized." Hayes understood the euphemism. Williams had been scheduled for transfer too. But before anyone could move, her phone exploded with incoming calls and messages. The emergency signal had reached not just her personal contacts, but her CID supervisor, base security, and, most importantly, the media contacts she'd cultivated during previous investigations. Ward's face went pale as she realized the extent of Hayes' preparation. "Colonel," Hayes said quietly, "I think we need to continue this conversation with a few more witnesses present." The door burst open as CID agents and base security personnel flooded into the office, followed by two reporters with cameras rolling. Colonel Patricia Ward, architect of systematic murder disguised as institutional protection, found herself surrounded by the very accountability she'd spent 3 years avoiding. The truth about Williams, Morrison, and who knew how many other victims was finally about to be exposed to the light. The silence in Colonel Ward's office stretched like a taut wire before snapping under the weight of revelation. CID agents moved with practiced efficiency, securing evidence while reporters captured every moment for national broadcast. Ward stood frozen behind her desk, the carefully constructed facade of 3 years crumbling in real time. "Colonel Patricia Ward," Agent Martinez announced formally, "you're under investigation for conspiracy, murder, and obstruction of justice in the deaths of Private Jessica Williams and Specialist Linda Morrison." Ward's lawyer arrived within minutes, a sharp-eyed Pentagon defense attorney who immediately invoked client confidentiality and demanded all recording devices be shut off. But the damage was already done. Hayes's emergency signal had triggered a cascade of accountability that no amount of institutional influence could contain. As Ward was escorted from her office in restraints, she caught Hayes's eye one final time. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," she whispered. "This goes deeper than you can imagine." Hayes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air conditioning. Ward's words carried the weight of threat and prophecy, suggesting that eliminating Williams and Morrison had been just the visible surface of something far more complex. The base command structure went into crisis mode. General Morrison's calls from the Pentagon came every 30 minutes, each more frantic than the last. The congressional hearing was now less than 48 hours away, and the military's carefully prepared narrative had just imploded on live television. Hayes found herself in the unusual position of conducting an investigation while being investigated herself. Internal Affairs wanted to know why she'd kept certain evidence secret, why she'd operated outside normal channels, why she'd involved civilian media in military proceedings. Staff Sergeant Colonel James Fletcher, Ward's temporary replacement, said during their afternoon briefing, "I understand you've uncovered serious misconduct, but your methods have created significant complications for this command." Fletcher was a career logistics officer, competent but cautious, the kind of leader who prioritized process over justice. His concerns were legitimate from an institutional perspective, but Hayes had moved beyond caring about institutional comfort. "Sir, 2 soldiers are dead because this institution prioritized reputation over accountability. If my methods caused complications, perhaps the institution needs to be complicated." Fletcher studied her for a long moment, recognizing both the defiance and the righteousness in her stance. "Staff Sergeant, you've opened a door that can't be closed. The question now is whether we walk through it with dignity or get dragged through by congressional subpoena." That evening, Hayes received a call from Margaret Williams, Jessica's mother. The woman's voice carried the exhausted grief of someone who'd spent weeks demanding answers from an unresponsive bureaucracy. "Staff Sergeant Hayes, I wanted to thank you for finding the truth about my daughter. The news said you risked your career to expose what really happened." Hayes sat in her quarters, staring at a photograph of Williams that she'd printed from the personnel file. Young, determined, hopeful. Everything the military claimed to protect and develop. "Mrs. Williams, your daughter died because she refused to accept harassment as normal. She fought for what was right, even when it cost her everything." The reporter said there might be other victims, other families who never got answers. Hayes thought about Morrison, about Rodriguez's haunted eyes, about the systematic pattern that Ward had orchestrated. "We're going to find them all, Mrs. Williams. Every victim deserves justice, and every family deserves truth." The call ended with promises and tears, but Hayes felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This investigation had evolved beyond a single case into a reckoning with institutional failure that stretched back years. Rodriguez appeared at her door an hour later, carrying a box of documents and digital storage devices. "Staff Sergeant, there's something else you need to see." Linda's phone contained more than just harassment recordings. She was documenting a financial network. Hayes invited him in, clearing her small dining table for the new evidence. Rodriguez spread out bank statements, payroll records, and coded correspondence that painted a picture of systematic corruption far beyond simple cover-up. Linda discovered that harassment complaints weren't just being suppressed, they were being monetized. Ward was receiving payments from defense contractors who wanted stable workforce environments for their military contracts. Hayes studied the financial documents, following money trails that connected Ward's personal accounts to corporate payments disguised as consulting fees. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars over 3 years, all tied to maintaining operational continuity and personnel stability. "Rodriguez, this suggests Ward wasn't just protecting harassers, she was being paid to eliminate complaint sources." Exactly. Linda found email chains discussing problematic personnel and corrective actions that would ensure contractor confidence in base operations. Hayes felt sick as the full scope of Ward's operation became clear. Williams and Morrison hadn't died to protect military reputation. They'd died to protect corporate profits that depended on maintaining exploitative workplace conditions. Her secure phone rang. Congressional aide. "Staff Sergeant Hayes, this is David Chen, Staff Director for the House Armed Services Committee. Chairman Williams wants to speak with you directly about Monday's hearing." Hayes's blood pressure spiked. Chairman Williams shared a surname with the victim, but she'd assumed it was coincidence. The aide's tone suggested otherwise. "Congressman Williams is Jessica's uncle," Chen's continued. "He's been fighting for months to get answers about his niece's death. Your investigation has finally given him the leverage he needs to demand accountability." The congressional hearing had just transformed from bureaucratic theater into personal vendetta. A sitting congressman with subpoena power and a dead niece was going to tear apart the military aviation program until every secret was exposed. What would you do if you discovered that a murder cover-up was really about corporate profits, and your investigation just gave a grieving congressman the evidence he needed for revenge? Drop your thoughts while we see how this explosive hearing unfolds. Sunday night, Hayes sat in her temporary quarters reviewing testimony notes and evidence files. Tomorrow's hearing would be broadcast live on C-SPAN, with national media coverage and congressional questioning that could reshape military justice protocols. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You've done well exposing Ward, but the network runs deeper. Morton Defense Systems, Blackwater Logistics, Pentagon Procurement. Ward was middle management, not the top. Watch your back after the hearing." Hayes screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Agent Martinez. Anonymous tips often proved worthless, but the specific company names suggested insider knowledge that warranted investigation. At 11 p.m., Rodriguez called with urgent news.
"Staff Sergeant, I've been going through Linda's hidden files. She documented at least 7 other suspicious deaths over the past 3 years, all involving female personnel who'd filed harassment complaints." Hayes grabbed her laptop and activated secure video calling. Rodriguez appeared on screen, surrounded by evidence boxes and looking like he hadn't slept in days. "7 more victims?" "7 confirmed. Possibly more." Linda was building a database of patterns before her death. Each case shows the same progression: harassment complaints, internal resolution, escalating pressure, then sudden death ruled as accident or suicide.
Rodriguez shared his screen, displaying a spreadsheet that Morrison had compiled. Names, dates, complaint details, resolution methods, death circumstances. The pattern was unmistakable and horrifying. Specialist Sarah Chen, Fort Bragg. Harassment complaints followed by accidental vehicle collision. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, Fort Hood. Complaints followed by suicide by hanging. Private Amanda Johnson, Fort Lewis. Complaints followed by accidental weapon discharge. Each case handled by command structures that included Ward's associates, each death occurring within weeks of complaint escalation, each investigation closed quickly with minimal outside scrutiny. Rodriguez, this is evidence of a nationwide conspiracy. Ward wasn't operating alone. She was part of a network that spans multiple bases and commands. Linda's final entry was dated 2 days before her death. She'd identified the coordinator, someone at Pentagon level who was orchestrating the entire system. Hayes leaned forward, studying Morrison's final database entry. The coordinator was listed only by initials, GM. But Morrison had included enough context clues to suggest someone with access to personnel files across multiple bases, someone with influence over investigative procedures, someone who could manipulate evidence and command structures. GM General Morrison, the same Pentagon official who had been pressuring Hayes to wrap up the Williams investigation quickly. The general who'd called her personally to discuss broader context and budget implications had been the mastermind behind a systematic murder conspiracy that had claimed at least 9 lives across 3 years. Hayes felt the world shift around her as she realized the scope of what she'd uncovered. Ward's exposure was just the beginning. The real architect of this operation held 4-star rank and Pentagon authority. Monday morning arrived with the cold clarity of Colorado winter. Hayes dressed in her dress blue uniform, every ribbon and decoration representing years of service that had led to this moment of reckoning. The congressional hearing room buzzed with nervous energy as representatives took their seats and cameras positioned for optimal coverage. Hayes sat at the witness table between Rodriguez and Dr. Chen, facing a panel of legislators who held the power to reshape military justice. Congressman Richard Williams, Jessica's uncle, sat at the center of the panel. His grief was carefully controlled, but visible in the tight lines around his eyes and the slight tremor in his voice as he called the hearing to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to examine the death of Private Jessica Williams and the institutional failures that led to her murder. Staff Sergeant Hayes, please state your findings for the record. Hayes activated her microphone and looked directly into the cameras that would broadcast her testimony to millions of Americans. Congressman Williams, members of the committee, Private Jessica Williams was murdered on October 10th by personnel under the command of Colonel Patricia Ward. This murder was part of a systematic conspiracy to eliminate female soldiers who filed harassment complaints, a conspiracy that extends to the highest levels of military command. Gasps echoed through the hearing room as Hayes laid out the evidence methodically. GPS data proving 4 people on the flight. Autopsy results showing defensive wounds. Financial records connecting Ward to defense contractor payments. Morrison's database, documenting nationwide patterns. But the bombshell came when Hayes presented Morrison's final evidence. Committee members, our investigation has identified General Marcus Morrison, currently serving as Pentagon Oversight for Military Aviation Programs, as the coordinator of this conspiracy. The hearing room erupted in chaos. General Morrison, watching from the Pentagon, immediately activated his legal team and began planning damage control. But Hayes had anticipated this response. General Morrison contacted me personally during this investigation, pressuring me to conclude the case quickly to avoid jeopardizing congressional budget approvals. He had detailed knowledge of evidence before it was officially reported, suggesting either inside information or direct involvement in the cover-up. Congressman Williams leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss and political authority. Staff Sergeant Hayes, are you testifying under oath that a sitting general conspired to murder American soldiers to protect defense contractor interests? Yes, Congressman. The evidence clearly establishes a pattern of systematic elimination disguised as institutional protection. The remainder of the hearing proceeded with clinical precision as Hayes presented each piece of evidence, each connection, each victim's story. Rodriguez testified about witnessing Williams's murder. Dr. Chen presented autopsy findings from multiple cases. Financial experts traced money flows from defense contractors through Pentagon accounts to Ward's personal finances. By noon, the foundation of military aviation oversight had cracked beyond repair. General Morrison was arrested during the lunch recess, taken into custody by federal marshals as he attempted to leave the Pentagon. His aide provided additional evidence in exchange for immunity, revealing a network of corruption that stretched across multiple commands and involved dozens of officers. The afternoon session focused on systemic reform. Congressman Williams, leveraging his personal stake and political capital, pushed through emergency legislation, strengthening whistleblower protections, and establishing independent oversight for harassment complaints. No soldier should die for demanding basic workplace dignity, Williams declared during his closing statement. This committee will ensure that Jessica Williams and Linda Morrison did not die in vain. Hayes left the hearing room that evening with the knowledge that justice had been served, but at a cost that would resonate throughout her military career. Institutional change was never comfortable for those who'd built their careers within existing systems. Agent Martinez met her outside the Capitol building with news that Ward had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Her testimony would provide evidence against additional conspirators and reveal the full scope of the murder network. Staff Sergeant, Ward's confession confirms your investigation completely. 9 murders across 3 years, all coordinated through Pentagon channels, all designed to protect corporate interests in military contracts. Hayes felt a mix of vindication and horror. 9 young women had died so that defense contractors could maintain profitable relationships with commands that suppressed accountability. The media coverage that followed was intense and unforgiving. National news networks broadcast Hayes' testimony repeatedly, using her investigation as a lens to examine broader military culture issues. Editorial boards called for comprehensive reform, victim families filed federal lawsuits, and congressional oversight expanded to include additional military installations. 3 weeks after the hearing, Hayes received orders for a new assignment: Special Investigator for the newly created Military Justice Oversight Division, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. Her mandate was clear: identify and eliminate corruption throughout the military justice system. The assignment came with promotion to Master Sergeant and authority to investigate any military installation or command structure. But more importantly, it came with the resources and backing to ensure that Williams's and Morrison's deaths had catalyzed real change. Rodriguez accepted a position as her senior investigative assistant, bringing both technical expertise and personal motivation to their new mission. Dr. Chen joined as chief medical examiner, lending forensic credibility to their investigations. On a cold December morning, Hayes visited Williams's gravesite in Billings, Montana. Margaret Williams had arranged for a new headstone that read, "Jessica Williams, soldier and truth-teller who refused to be silenced." She would have been proud, Margaret said quietly, standing beside Hayes in the cemetery wind. Jessica always said the military could be better if good people were willing to fight for change. Hayes placed a small GPS device on the grave, a symbol of the technology that had exposed the truth and a promise that Williams's sacrifice would continue protecting others. Back at Fort Carson, the changes were visible and substantial. New harassment reporting protocols required independent civilian oversight. Personnel transfers needed approval from multiple commands to prevent retaliation. Medical examiner reports could no longer be classified without federal judge approval. Colonel Fletcher, Ward's permanent replacement, had implemented comprehensive culture change programs that emphasized accountability over image management. The base that had once prioritized reputation over justice was slowly transforming into an institution that protected its most vulnerable members. Hayes's new office occupied the same building where Ward had once operated her conspiracy. But instead of suppressing complaints, Hayes' team was encouraging them, investigating them thoroughly, and ensuring that every victim received justice. Her first major case involved suspected financial corruption at Naval Station Norfolk. Her second exposed a harassment network at Marine Corps Base Quantico. Each investigation built on the foundation established by Williams's case, demonstrating that accountability was possible when investigators were given proper authority and protection. 6 months after the congressional hearing, Hayes received a call from a young airman at Lackland Air Force Base. "Master Sergeant Hayes, my name is Airman Jennifer Chen. I've been experiencing harassment from my supervisors, and they're pressuring me to withdraw my complaints. I heard about your investigation unit from the news coverage." Hayes activated her digital recorder, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. "Airman Chen, tell me everything. Every detail, every threat, every attempt to silence you. We're going to document it all, and we're going to make sure you get justice." The conversation lasted 90 minutes, covering harassment patterns, command responses, and attempted intimidation that followed familiar scripts. But this time, the victim was reporting to investigators with authority and resources to act. This time, justice wouldn't be delayed or denied. Hayes ended the call and immediately began coordinating with federal agents, congressional oversight staff, and media contacts who'd proven reliable during the Williams investigation. The network that had once protected harassers was now being used to protect victims. As she prepared for another investigation that would likely expose institutional failure and individual corruption, Hayes thought about Williams and Morrison, about the courage it had taken to file complaints knowing the personal cost, about the sacrifice that had ultimately catalyzed systemic change. This is exactly what we hoped for when we started following Hayes's investigation. Seeing one person's courage create lasting change that protects others. What's your take on this transformation from institutional cover-up to active accountability? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how one investigation can reshape an entire system. The Lackland investigation proceeded with the methodical precision that had become Hayes's signature approach. Within 72 hours, her team had documented a harassment network involving 12 officers and 30 enlisted personnel, protected by a command structure that prioritized unit cohesion over individual rights. But this time, the response was swift and decisive. Federal investigators arrested 7 officers within a week. Congressional oversight committees launched immediate inquiries. Media coverage focused on the effectiveness of new accountability measures rather than institutional failure to address known problems. The contrast with Williams's case was striking. Where once victims faced retaliation and silence, they now received federal protection and national support. Where once investigations were suppressed and manipulated, they now proceeded with transparency and congressional oversight. Rodriguez, working alongside Hayes on the Lackland case, marveled at the transformation.
Staff Sergeant, Master Sergeant, sorry. This is what Linda always dreamed about. A system that actually protects people who speak up instead of punishing them.
Hayes nodded, reviewing testimony from Airman Chen and 6 other victims who'd come forward after news of the investigation broke. Each story followed patterns that had once been invisible to outside observers but were now immediately recognizable to trained investigators. Rodriguez, your girlfriend saved more lives than she ever knew. Her documentation of patterns gave us the roadmap for recognizing institutional failure before it becomes systematic elimination. The financial investigation at Lackland revealed connections to defense contractors who'd been providing consulting fees to officers in exchange for maintaining stable workforce environments. The same corporate network that had funded Ward's operation was operating at multiple installations, suggesting coordination at levels Hayes was still uncovering. Dr. Chen's forensic analysis of previous deaths at Lackland identified 2 suspicious cases that had been ruled accidental but showed patterns consistent with the Williams and Morrison murders. Families who'd accepted tragic accidents as explanations were now demanding federal investigations. The scope of corruption was staggering, but so was the speed of accountability. Congressional legislation passed 6 months earlier had created enforcement mechanisms that were proving devastatingly effective against institutional cover-ups. Hayes's phone rang with updates throughout the investigation. Federal prosecutors securing plea agreements. Congressional committees scheduling additional hearings. Media outlets preparing comprehensive coverage of systemic reform. But the most important call came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Hayes, this is General Patricia Stevenson, new commanding officer for Pentagon Oversight of Military Justice. I wanted to personally thank you for your service and discuss expansion of your investigative authority. General Stevenson was General Morrison's replacement, a career military police officer with extensive experience in institutional reform. Her appointment had been specifically designed to signal serious commitment to cultural change. General, thank you for the call. We're making progress,
but the network of corruption runs deeper than we initially realized. That's exactly why I'm calling. The Secretary of Defense is authorizing expansion of your unit to include permanent teams at every major installation. You'll have authority to investigate any allegation, access to all evidence, and direct reporting to my office.
Hayes felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. The authority she was being granted represented unprecedented power to reshape military culture, but it also made her a target for those who preferred the old systems. General, we'll need significant resources and protection for investigators. The people we're investigating have proven willing to use extreme measures to protect their interests.
Already arranged? FBI liaison officers assigned to each team, congressional oversight committees monitoring all investigations, media partnerships, ensuring transparency. The institutional protection that once enabled corruption is now being used to enable accountability. The conversation ended with promises and expectations that would reshape Hayes' career and expand her mission far beyond what she'd imagined possible when she first listened to Williams's final moments. 3 months later, Hayes stood before another congressional committee, but this time as an expert witness testifying about investigative successes rather than institutional failures. Congressman Williams, committee members, our expanded investigative authority has resulted in 47 arrests, of court-martial convictions, and comprehensive reform at 17 installations. More importantly, we've created reporting mechanisms that encourage victims to come forward instead of suffering in silence. The statistics were impressive, but Hayes focused on individual stories. Victims who'd received justice, families who'd found closure, commands that had transformed from predatory environments into protective institutions. Congressman Williams, now chairing the Military Justice Reform Subcommittee, had become a powerful advocate for continued oversight and accountability. Master Sergeant Hayes, in your professional opinion, have we eliminated the systematic problems that led to my niece's murder? Hayes considered the question carefully. Institutional change was measured in decades, not months, and cultural transformation required sustained effort beyond any single investigation. Congressman, we've created systems that make systematic abuse far more difficult and far more likely to be exposed quickly. But cultural change requires constant vigilance and continued commitment to accountability over convenience. The hearing concluded with authorization for additional funding and expansion of investigative authority to include civilian contractors working with military personnel. The network that had once operated in shadows now faced comprehensive oversight and federal prosecution. That evening, Hayes returned to Fort Carson for a ceremony honoring Williams and Morrison. The base command had commissioned a memorial recognizing their courage and the institutional changes their sacrifices had catalyzed. Margaret Williams spoke at the dedication, her voice steady but emotional as she addressed hundreds of soldiers gathered in the evening light. My daughter believed the military could be an institution worthy of her service and sacrifice. She died fighting for that belief, but her death wasn't meaningless. Every policy change, every investigation, every victim who now receives justice proves that Jessica's courage created lasting change. Hayes stood with Rodriguez and Dr. Chen, watching as the memorial was unveiled. The inscription read, "In honor of all soldiers who demanded accountability and paid the ultimate price for institutional change." But below the formal inscription was a smaller line that captured the essence of their mission. Justice isn't a feeling. It's a file that outweighs denial. As the ceremony concluded and soldiers returned to their duties, Hayes reflected on the journey from Williams's death to systemic reform. One investigation had exposed a network of corruption spanning multiple commands and involving dozens of officers.
One victim's courage had catalyzed changes that would protect thousands of future soldiers. Her secure phone buzzed with a new case notification: suspicious deaths at Fort Benning, possible harassment connection, victims' families demanding federal investigation. Hayes smiled grimly as she read the details. The work was far from over, but the tools for justice were now sharper and more effective than ever before. Rodriguez appeared beside her, holding his own case notification from Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. "Ready for the next battle, Master Sergeant?" Hayes looked up at Williams's memorial, thinking about the young woman who'd refused to accept harassment as normal military culture, who'd demanded accountability, even when it cost her everything. "Rodriguez, we're not fighting battles anymore. We're building institutions, and Jessica Williams showed us how." 6 months later, Hayes received a call that brought the investigation full circle. "Master Sergeant Hayes, this is Agent Martinez, FBI. Colonel Ward died in federal custody this morning. Heart attack, apparently natural causes. But she left something for you." Hayes drove to the federal detention facility where Ward had been held pending trial. Agent Martinez met her in a sterile conference room with a sealed envelope bearing her name. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Ward's precise handwriting. "Master Sergeant Hayes, you were right about everything. The network was vast, the corruption systematic, the victims numerous. But you were wrong about one thing. I didn't start this system. I inherited it from my predecessor, who inherited it from his predecessor. This conspiracy has roots going back decades, and my arrest hasn't eliminated it entirely. There are names I never gave prosecutors, accounts I never revealed, operations still active that you haven't discovered. The GPS timestamp that exposed my involvement, 14/27/33, was the moment Jessica Williams proved that truth can't be silenced forever. But truth requires constant vigilance. Stay alert. Stay committed. And remember that every victim deserves a voice, even when silence seems safer. Patricia Ward. Hayes stared at the letter, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Ward's final message was part confession, part warning, part challenge to continue the work beyond her individual case. Agent Martinez leaned forward. "Master Sergeant, we found additional evidence in Ward's cell. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, encrypted communications with active duty officers, financial records suggesting ongoing operations." Hayes folded the letter carefully and placed it in her jacket pocket. Ward's death had closed one chapter of accountability, but opened another chapter of investigation. "Agent Martinez, I think Colonel Ward just gave us our next case." 2 years after Williams's death, Hayes stood in the same cemetery in Billings, where she'd placed the GPS device on the grave. But this time, she wasn't alone. Families of 17 victims had joined her for an annual memorial service that honored all soldiers who'd died for demanding accountability. Margaret Williams approached as the ceremony concluded, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from her daughter's favorite garden. "Master Sergeant Hayes, Jessica would have been amazed by everything that's changed. 47 arrests, comprehensive reform, protection for whistleblowers. Her death created exactly the kind of institutional accountability she believed was possible." Hayes nodded, thinking about the ongoing investigations, the networks still being exposed, the work that continued daily at 17 installations across the country. "Mrs. Williams, your daughter didn't just create change, she created a legacy. Every victim who comes forward, every investigation that prevents future harm, every family that gets closure, carries forward Jessica's courage." As the sun set over the Montana landscape, Hayes received a text message on her secure phone.
Another case, another installation, another opportunity to ensure that Williams' sacrifice continued protecting others. She looked one final time at the memorial headstone, reading the inscription that had become her personal mission statement. Jessica Williams, soldier and truth-teller, who refused to be silenced. GPS coordinates flashed across her phone screen. 45.7835 N 128.5 W, marking the location of another investigation that would test institutional commitment to accountability over convenience. Hayes smiled as she realized the coordinates were just numbers on a screen, but they represented something far more powerful. The promise that every victim deserves truth, every family deserves closure, and every institution can be reformed by individuals willing to demand justice. The GPS timestamp that had exposed Williams's murder, 14/27/33, had become a symbol of accountability that couldn't be suppressed or denied. Truth, documented and preserved, would always outweigh institutional denial. Hayes walked back to her car, phone already ringing with calls from congressional oversight staff, federal investigators, and victim advocates who'd become partners in the mission Williams had died defending. The work continued. The mission endured. And somewhere in the coordinates and timestamps and digital evidence that formed the foundation of modern justice, Jessica Williams's courage lived on, protecting soldiers she'd never met, but who deserved the same accountability she'd demanded for herself. Justice wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a file that outweighed denial, a system that protected truth-tellers, and a legacy that would survive long after the individual investigators who'd fought to create it. Hayes drove through the Montana evening toward her flight back to Washington, where new cases waited, and new victims deserved the same thoroughness that had exposed Williams's murder and transformed military justice. The GPS unit on her dashboard displayed her current coordinates, but Hayes knew she was really navigating by a different system entirely, one that measured progress in lives protected, accountability achieved, and institutions reformed by the courage of individuals who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Recording stopped. Truth didn't. 3 years later, Hayes stood before the graduating class of the Military Justice Academy, an institution that hadn't existed when Williams died, but now trained every investigator in the armed forces. The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as 200 newly commissioned officers prepared to take the oath that would make them guardians of military accountability. Class of 2000, Hayes began, her master sergeant stripes catching the stage lights. You're entering a profession that didn't exist 5 years ago. Before Jessica Williams's death, military justice was handled by the same command structures that often created the problems we investigated. Today, you represent independent authority accountable only to truth and justice. In the front row sat Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Dr. Chen's daughter, who'd chosen military justice after watching her mother's forensic work expose institutional corruption. Beside her, Second Lieutenant Rodriguez Jr. carried forward his father's commitment to protecting victims who couldn't protect themselves. Hayes clicked to her first slide, a photograph of Williams in dress uniform, young and determined. Private Jessica Williams was 23 when she died for demanding basic workplace dignity. Her murder exposed a network of corruption that had operated for decades, protected by institutional silence and bureaucratic cover-up. The cadets listened with the intensity of soldiers preparing for combat, because that's exactly what they were doing. Military justice had become a battlefield where accountability fought against institutional inertia, where individual courage challenged systematic abuse.
Your first assignment after graduation will be reviewing cold cases from the pre-reform era. We estimate there are at least 40 additional suspicious deaths that warrant reinvestigation. Families have waited years for answers. Your job is ensuring they finally get truth. Hayes advanced to the next slide. Organizational charts showing the investigative network that now operated across every military installation. Independent teams, federal oversight, congressional monitoring, media partnerships. The infrastructure of accountability that Williams's sacrifice had catalyzed. The tools you'll use didn't exist when I investigated Williams's case. GPS tracking is now mandatory for all personnel in potentially dangerous situations. Digital evidence preservation prevents tampering with official records. Automated reporting systems bypass command influence over harassment complaints. A cadet in the third row raised her hand. Master Sergeant, what happens when institutional resistance pushes back against our investigations? Hayes smiled grimly. Excellent question, Cadet Morrison. Linda Morrison's younger sister had followed her own path to military justice, driven by the same determination that had gotten Linda killed. Institutional resistance is predictable and constant. Commands will pressure you to close cases quickly. Accept convenient explanations. Prioritize reputation over justice. Your job is ignoring that pressure completely. She clicked to testimonial videos from victims who'd received justice through the new investigative protocols. Soldiers speaking directly to camera about harassment that had been addressed swiftly and thoroughly, about complaints that led to real consequences instead of retaliation. These are the voices that matter. Not generals worried about budget hearings, not contractors concerned about stability ratings, not politicians focused on campaign donations. The victims who trust you with their truth are your only constituency. Hayes spent the next hour detailing investigative techniques, evidence preservation protocols, and federal coordination procedures that had evolved from lessons learned during the Williams case. Every process had been tested through 3 years of field investigation and refined through congressional oversight. The ceremony concluded with the Justice Oath, new words added to military tradition that acknowledged responsibility to truth over institutional loyalty. I solemnly swear to investigate without bias, document without fear, and report without compromise. I will protect those who cannot protect themselves, speak for those who have been silenced, and ensure that justice serves truth rather than convenience. As 200 voices recited the oath in unison, Hayes felt Williams's presence in the room. The young woman whose courage had created this moment, this institution, this commitment to accountability that would protect thousands of future soldiers. After the ceremony, Hayes walked across the Academy campus to the Williams Memorial Library, a research facility housing documentation of every military justice case since the reforms began. Margaret Williams had donated her daughter's personal effects to establish the memorial, creating a permanent reminder of the cost of institutional failure. Rodriguez met her at the library entrance, carrying a thick folder of case files. Master Sergeant, we've got 17 new cases this month. Pattern analysis suggests possible network activity at 3 Marine Corps installations and 2 Army bases. Hayes reviewed the files as they walked through the library. Each case followed protocols developed during the Williams investigation. Immediate federal notification, independent evidence collection, victim protection measures, congressional oversight activation. Rodriguez, what's the timeline on federal response? 72 hours for initial assessment, 1 week for full investigative team deployment. FBI liaisons are already coordinating with base commanders to secure evidence and interview witnesses. The efficiency was remarkable compared to the institutional delays that had once protected corruption. Williams's case had taken months to resolve only because Hayes had operated without proper authority or resources. Modern investigations proceeded with federal backing and unlimited access to evidence. They entered Hayes's office, the same room where Williams's personnel file had first crossed her desk, but now equipped with secure communications, federal database access, and direct reporting to Pentagon oversight. Her computer chimed with an encrypted message from congressional staff. Master Sergeant Hayes, committee requests your testimony regarding proposed expansion of investigative authority to civilian contractors. Tuesday hearing, 0900 hours. Transportation and accommodation arranged. Hayes accepted the invitation and forwarded details to her team. Congressional testimony had become routine as legislative oversight expanded to address every aspect of military justice reform. The afternoon brought a call that reminded Hayes why the work mattered. Master Sergeant Hayes, this is Private Jennifer Walsh, Fort Campbell. I heard about your unit from the orientation briefing. I need to report harassment that my command is trying to suppress. Hayes activated her digital recorder and pulled up the standard intake form on her computer. 3 years of experience had taught her to document everything from the first contact. Private Walsh, you've reached the Military Justice Oversight Division. Everything you tell me is protected by federal whistleblower statutes, and retaliation against you is a federal crime. Tell me what's happening. Walsh's story followed familiar patterns: inappropriate comments escalating to physical intimidation, command pressure to handle it internally, threats of career consequences for filing formal complaints. But this time, the victim was reporting to investigators with authority to act immediately. Private Walsh, I'm assigning Agent Peterson from our Fort Campbell team to your case. He'll contact you within 2 hours with instructions for evidence preservation and victim protection protocols. Your command will be notified of federal investigation status, which prohibits any retaliation or interference. The call lasted 30 minutes, covering details that would once have taken weeks to document through official channels. Hayes's team had streamlined reporting procedures to minimize victim exposure and maximize evidence preservation. As she finished Walsh's intake documentation, Hayes reflected on the transformation from Williams's case to routine justice procedures. What had once required extraordinary courage and career-ending risks was now standard operating procedure, backed by federal authority. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Williams. Watching your Academy speech online. Jessica would be so proud of everything you've built. Thank you for keeping her memory alive through action. Hayes smiled as she replied, Your daughter's courage created all of this. We're just carrying forward her mission. The evening brought a secure video conference with investigative teams at 12 installations, coordinating evidence sharing and pattern analysis that might reveal network connections between seemingly isolated cases. Agent Peterson reported from Fort Campbell, Private Walsh's case connects to 3 previous complaints involving the same supervisor. Financial analysis shows unusual overtime payments that suggest possible intimidation funding. Similar reports came from other installations: harassment networks funded through manipulated payroll systems, command structures protecting abusers through strategic transfers, corporate contracts providing incentives for suppressing accountability. Hayes realized they weren't just investigating individual cases anymore. They were dismantling systematic abuse networks that had operated for decades under institutional protection. Team leaders, I want comprehensive financial analysis on all current cases. Look for payment patterns, contract connections, resource flows that might indicate coordination above installation level.
The investigation was evolving beyond individual justice toward institutional transformation that would prevent future Williams and Morrison cases by eliminating the systems that had enabled their murders. At midnight, Hayes finally left her office and drove through the quiet Academy campus. The buildings housing future military justice officers glowed softly in the darkness, representing hope for accountability that Williams had died believing was possible. Her secure phone rang with an international call. Australian military officials requesting consultation on establishing similar oversight programs. Williams's case had become a global model for military justice reform, inspiring changes in armed forces worldwide. Master Sergeant Hayes, Colonel Jennifer Anderson, Australian Defence Force. We've studied your investigative protocols and would like to discuss implementation of similar programs for our personnel. Hayes accepted the consultation request and scheduled video conferences with Canadian and British officials who'd made similar inquiries. Williams' sacrifice was protecting soldiers far beyond American installations. As she reached her quarters, Hayes paused to look up at the Colorado stars that had witnessed Williams's final flight 3 years earlier. The night sky looked the same, but everything underneath had changed. GPS tracking now protected every soldier in potentially dangerous situations. Digital evidence preservation prevented tampering with official records. Automated reporting systems bypassed command influence over harassment complaints. Federal oversight ensured swift response to victim reports. Most importantly, cultural change was becoming visible in decreased harassment reports, increased victim confidence in reporting systems, and command emphasis on accountability over image management. Hayes entered her quarters and found a package waiting. Advance copies of the book she'd written about the Williams investigation. Time-stamped Truth: How One Soldier's Murder Reformed Military Justice would be published next month, with proceeds supporting victim advocacy programs. She opened to the dedication page. For Jessica Williams, Linda Morrison, and all soldiers who demanded accountability at the ultimate cost. Your courage created the justice you died seeking. The final chapter detailed ongoing investigations, systematic reforms, and cultural changes that ensured Williams's death had catalyzed lasting institutional transformation rather than temporary attention. Hayes's secure phone chimed with case notifications from 6 different installations, new reports that would be investigated with thoroughness and authority that Williams never received, but that her sacrifice had made possible for every future victim. She smiled as she realized that Williams's GPS coordinates, the timestamp 14/27/33 that had exposed the truth, were now permanently embedded in military justice protocols as a reminder that evidence could overcome any attempt at institutional denial. Justice wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a system that honored truth-tellers like Jessica Williams by ensuring their courage protected others long after their voices were silenced. Truth had found its permanent frequency, broadcasting justice across every installation, every investigation, every victim who would never again face the choice between silence and death that Williams had confronted in her final moments 500 feet above Colorado. Recording stopped. Truth didn't. And neither would the justice Williams had died to create. Hayes stood at her window, watching dawn break over the academy where future investigators were already beginning their morning formation. Each new day brought fresh opportunities to honor Williams's memory through action, to transform institutional failure into systematic protection. Her phone displayed tomorrow's schedule, congressional testimony on international military justice cooperation, case review with federal prosecutors, and a video call with families whose loved ones had received justice through the programs Williams's death had created. Every appointment represented another thread in the web of accountability that now spanned continents. The GPS coordinates on her desk calendar showed her next assignment location, but Hayes knew she was really navigating by Williams's moral compass, the unwavering belief that every soldier deserved dignity, safety, and justice, regardless of rank or institutional convenience. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Margaret Williams entered, carrying coffee and wearing the smile of someone who'd found peace through purpose. "The morning news mentioned 3 more arrests from your team's latest investigation," Margaret said quietly. "Jessica's legacy keeps growing." Hayes accepted the coffee gratefully. "Your daughter taught us that orders don't cover murder, but more than that, she proved that one person's courage can rebuild entire institutions." Outside, 200 future investigators began their training with Williams's photograph, watching from every classroom wall. Truth had found its voice. Justice had found its system. And Williams had found her immortality in every victim who would never face her choice between silence and death. The mission continued. The promise endured. Forever.
You are not alone. Someone wants to hear you. Share your story. Thank you for watching to the end. Please like and subscribe to Stereo.